A lot of homeowners do not have flood insurance. Some sad news. Insurance experts estimating about only a fifth, 20% of homeowners hit by Harvey have flood insurance. Much of Houston falls outside areas where people are required to buy flood insurance. During Hurricane Katrina, around half of the homeowners had coverage. Well, after the October floods, we learned that firsthand. Not all businesses and homeowners have policies here in our state, and the questions are now rising about flood insurance. Who needs it? How do you get it? How much does it cost? This morning, we are bringing in insurance coverage attorney J.R. Murphy into our studio to give us more clarity. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, so let's talk about first, when it comes to storms and weather, what is typically covered or not covered?
Well, a typical homeowner's policy is going to cover the primary things like fire. They used to be called fire policies, and wind or hail. So from a hurricane, for example, damage done by the force of wind would be covered. In what we saw in Katrina, what we saw here without a hurricane, and of course what we're seeing in Houston is damage from just rising water, which a typical policy doesn't cover. There is a national program, the National Flood Insurance Program, that is kind of administered under FEMA that you can purchase flood insurance for, and people that live in historic flood areas are usually required to buy that, and as we see, people that are not usually don't. But you can get flood insurance through your homeowner's company. There's also a great website to help with that called floodsmart.gov. Of course, you could go to FEMA.gov as well to give information about where you can get flood insurance.
All right, so does a typical flood insurance policy cover a house, the building itself, and belongings, or are those treated separately?
Well, there are two separate coverages under a flood policy. Unlike a homeowner's policy where many separate types of coverages could be purchased, you can buy flood insurance for the building itself, you can buy it for the contents or the business or personal property inside of the building, and then they usually have some type of extra up to about $30,000 if you have to lift your house, demolish your house to comply with new building codes or new flood plain drawings. So it's much more limited coverage than you would have under your typical homeowner's policy. There's also there is a catastrophic savings account here in South Carolina for folks. It's kind of like a health savings account or a college savings account. You can put money away and you could use it if you had storm-related damages, your deductibles. A flood policy, for example, will not provide for additional living expenses if you have to live in a hotel, and many people in Columbia had to live in hotels or rented apartments. My parents actually lost their house in the flood, and they did not get any specific money under their insurance policy for those expenses, and they only had their house covered, not their contents.
And JR, you have an interesting perspective too, because you were worried about losing your dad's his Bronze Star because of all of the damage, but you had a positive outcome after all that.
Well, as we see, and we're seeing in Texas, there's a lot of good in people. In my parents' house, actually the whole ceiling collapsed, so unlike a lot of people, so they had about a foot of insulation and mud in their house. A young man who'd served in the Marine Corps found out that my dad, when he served in Korea, was awarded a Bronze Star. My parents were really knew the house was a total loss, but he was determined to go in there, and in that muck, he found my dad's Bronze Star.
Oh, wow. There it is.
And so that's the kind of story that you remember.
And that's a bright side to something that is certainly so dark. And obviously all of our hearts go out to Texas, because we know all too well what they are dealing with and will deal with for years to come. JR, thank you for joining us with very important information on flood insurance.
You're welcome.